The afternoon sun filtered through the large windows of Rosie's diner, casting warm light across the checkered floor where families sat enjoying their meals, and conversations filled the air with a comfortable buzz. 7-year-old Marcus sat at the counter swinging his legs back and forth as he watched the holographic menu dance in front of him with images of burgers and milkshakes that looked almost real enough to touch. His mother Lisa stood beside him talking to the waitress about the new shipment of supplies that had arrived from the outer colonies. Her voice calm and friendly as she always was with everyone she met. Marcus had always loved coming to this diner because it reminded him of the old Earth stories his grandmother used to tell him about simpler times before humanity reached the stars and made friends with aliens from distant worlds. The red leather seats were patched in places, and the chrome on the counter had lost some of its shine, but that only made it feel more like home to the young boy who had lived in New Seattle his entire short life. He tapped his fingers on the counter to the rhythm of the old music playing from the speakers overhead, a song from centuries ago that somehow still made people smile. The door chimed as it opened, and a large man walked in with heavy footsteps that seemed to announce his presence before anyone even looked up. Derek Hoffman was not someone most people wanted to deal with on a good day, and today was shaping up to be one of his bad ones based on the scowl carved into his weathered face. He had spent the morning dealing with complaints from his workers at the mining colony, and his patience had worn thin hours ago, leaving only anger and frustration in its place as he stomped toward an empty booth near the back. Marcus slid down from his stool with his datapad, clutched in his small hands because he had just discovered something amazing in his game that he absolutely needed to show his mother right away. The boy moved quickly between the tables with the kind of fearless energy that only children possess, completely unaware of the dangers that sometimes lurked in the world around him. His eyes were fixed on his mother's back as he rushed forward, not seeing the large man who stepped directly into his path at exactly the wrong moment. The collision was not hard, but it was enough to make Derek stumble slightly and drop the menu he had been holding. Marcus bounced backward and landed on his bottom with a small oof of surprise, his datapad skittering across the floor and coming to rest under a nearby table. The boy looked up with wide eyes, ready to apologize because his mother had taught him to always say sorry when he made a mistake. But the words died in his throat when he saw the expression on Derek's face. Pure rage twisted the man's features into something ugly and frightening as he stared down at the child who had dared to bump into him. Derek had been dealing with what he considered disrespect all day, and something inside him snapped at that moment, all the anger and hatred he carried finding a target in the innocent boy at his feet. His hand moved before his brain could catch up with his actions, swinging down in a vicious arc that connected with Marcus's face with a crack that echoed through the suddenly silent diner. The force of the blow sent Marcus sprawling across the floor, his small body sliding several feet before coming to a stop near the counter. Blood began to trickle from his split lip and tears welled up in his eyes as pain exploded across his cheek and jaw. The entire diner seemed to freeze in that moment, every conversation stopping mid-sentence as people turned to stare at what had just happened in shocked disbelief. Lisa screamed and ran to her son, dropping to her knees beside him and gathering him into her arms as maternal instinct took over every other thought in her mind. She checked his face with trembling fingers, her heart breaking at the sight of blood on her baby's lips and the red mark already beginning to swell on his dark skin. Marcus clung to her and tried not to cry, because he wanted to be brave like his father always told him to be. But the pain and fear were too much for a 7-year-old to handle alone. Derek stood over them with his fists still clenched, breathing hard as the adrenaline pumped through his system. He felt justified in his actions because in his twisted view of the world, children needed to learn respect, and this boy had shown him none by running into him like that. The fact that Marcus was black only added fuel to Derek's internal fire of prejudice, beliefs he had carried from Earth's darker past and refused to let go of, despite humanity's progress among the stars. The other patrons began to move, some standing from their seats while others reached for their communicators. Rosie herself emerged from the kitchen with a kitchen towel still in her hands, her elderly face going pale as she took in the scene before her. She had run this diner for 30 years and had seen her share of trouble, but never had someone struck a child right in front of her, and her hands shook as she tried to figure out what to do. Lisa's shock began to fade and was replaced by something colder and more dangerous than anyone in that diner could have imagined. She held her son close with one arm while her other hand reached into her purse and pulled out her communicator, her fingers steady despite the fury burning in her chest. The other customers who knew the Johnson family felt a chill run down their spines because they understood what was about to happen, and several of them moved quietly toward the exits, not to leave but to make sure no one else did either. Derek's friends, who had been waiting in his vehicle outside, came in through the door laughing about something, until they saw the scene and their laughter died. They moved to stand beside Derek in a show of solidarity, not yet understanding the magnitude of what their friend had just done. Derek himself was beginning to feel the first stirrings of unease as he noticed how quiet the diner had become and how people were looking at him with expressions that ranged from horror to grim satisfaction. Lisa's call connected and Vincent Johnson's face appeared on the holographic display, his strong features composed and calm as he attended his meeting across the city. He saw his wife's expression first, then his son's injured face in the background, and though his face did not change, everyone in his office felt the atmosphere shift into something deadly. Lisa did not need to explain much, just gave him the location and confirmed that the man who had hurt their son was still present. And Vincent's single-word response of understood carried more weight than 1,000 threats could have. Vincent Johnson sat in his office on the 47th floor of the tallest building in New Seattle, a structure of glass and steel that overlooked the sprawling metropolis below, where millions of humans and aliens conducted their daily business. The 3 Vaxian ambassadors across from him had been negotiating for the better part of 2 hours, their reptilian features betraying nothing as they discussed the terms of protection for their merchant fleets that traveled through human space. Vincent had built his reputation on being fair but firm in such dealings, and the Vaxians respected him for it, even though they knew exactly what kind of man they were dealing with. The communicator on Vincent's wrist vibrated with the priority signal that only 3 people in the entire galaxy had access to use, and he held up one hand to pause the negotiations as he activated the device. His wife's face appeared in the holographic projection, and Vincent's experienced eyes took in every detail in less than a second, from her controlled expression to the protective way she held their son to the blood he could see on Marcus's face. Years of running a criminal empire had taught him to read situations instantly and make decisions without hesitation, and this situation required no deliberation whatsoever. He asked only one question and received the answer he needed, then stood from his chair with a fluid grace that belied his imposing size. Vincent was a man who commanded respect through presence alone, standing well over 6 feet tall with broad shoulders and an air of absolute authority that made even hardened criminals think twice before crossing him. His dark skin was smooth and unmarked, his close-cropped hair showing distinguished gray at the temples, and his suit was tailored to perfection in a way that announced wealth and power without being ostentatious. The Vaxians exchanged glances among themselves because they had heard stories about what happened when someone threatened Vincent Johnson's family, tales that circulated through both legal and illegal channels across a dozen star systems. They began to gather their materials without being told, understanding that this meeting was over and that they were witnessing something that would likely become another chapter in the legend of the most powerful crime boss in the Eastern sector. Vincent turned to Raymond Carter, who stood near the door, a man who had served in the Earth Defense Force for 20 years before retiring and finding his way into Vincent's organization. Raymond was solid and dependable, a former colonel who had seen combat on 3 different worlds and brought military precision to everything he did. He met Vincent's eyes and nodded once, already reaching for his own communicator to start making the necessary calls before Vincent even spoke the order aloud. The words were simple and direct as Vincent told Raymond to gather everyone, and the emphasis on all of them made it clear that this was not a small matter that could be handled with a few enforcers. Raymond began sending out the signals immediately, using the encrypted network that connected Vincent's organization across the city and beyond. Within seconds, hundreds of people were receiving the alert and dropping whatever they were doing to respond, because when Vincent Johnson called, everyone meant everyone without exception. Vincent walked to the window and looked out over the city he had claimed as his territory, through a combination of intelligence, ruthlessness, and an unwavering code of honor that set him apart from other criminals. He had built his empire from nothing, starting as a young man in the streets and rising through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance that even his enemies had to admire. People called him a monster and a criminal, and both labels were accurate in their own way, but they missed the essential truth that Vincent Johnson protected his own with a ferocity that bordered on Legendary, his phone buzzed. Again, and he saw messages coming in from his lieutenants, confirming their mobilization, reports of vehicles being dispatched and weapons being checked. Vincent did not need an army to deal with one man who had struck his son, but he wanted to send a message that would echo through every corner of his territory and beyond. The message was simple enough that even a child could understand it. You do not touch Vincent Johnson's family and expect to walk away unscathed. Raymond approached with a tablet, showing the preliminary information his people had already compiled on Derek Hoffman, and Vincent scanned the data with practiced efficiency. He saw a man with a history of violence and prejudice, someone who had left a trail of complaints and incidents across multiple colonies without ever facing real consequences. Derek was exactly the kind of person who believed his position gave him immunity, who thought that might made right, and that those he considered beneath him deserved whatever treatment he chose to give them. The Vaxians had quietly left the office, and Vincent appreciated their discretion, making a mental note to give them favorable terms when they resumed negotiations later. He changed out of his business jacket and into something more practical, though he maintained the appearance of a successful businessman rather than adopting any kind of tactical gear. Vincent had learned long ago that true power did not need to announce itself with weapons and armor. It simply was. The elevator ride down to the ground floor took less than a minute, but Vincent used that time to center himself and push down the rage that threatened to cloud his judgment. He had learned to control his emotions years ago because anger made people stupid, and stupid people made mistakes that got them killed. What he felt for the man who had hurt his son went beyond simple anger into something colder and more purposeful, a determination to exact justice in a way that would leave no doubt about the consequences of such actions. 3 vehicles waited at the curb, sleek black cars that announced their purpose through sheer presence alone. Vincent's personal security detail had assembled with military precision, 8 men and women who had been chosen for their skills and loyalty above all else. They were dressed in suits that concealed body armor and weapons, their faces calm and professional as they waited for their boss to give them direction. Raymond held the door for Vincent and then slid into the passenger seat while the convoy began moving through the city streets. Traffic seemed to part before them as other drivers saw the vehicles and decided they had somewhere else to be, because everyone in New Seattle recognized Vincent Johnson's motorcade and knew better than to get in its way. The ride to Rosie's Diner took 12 minutes through the afternoon traffic, and Vincent spent that time reviewing the information on his tablet and formulating exactly how he wanted this situation to play out. He thought about his son's face on that video call, the blood and tears and pain that no child should have to experience. Marcus was a good kid, smart and kind and full of the innocent joy that Vincent had lost somewhere in his own childhood. Vincent had promised himself when Marcus was born that he would give his son a better life than he had, that he would protect him from the ugliness of the world for as long as possible. Some man in a diner had just destroyed that promise with one violent action, and Vincent intended to make sure that man understood the full weight of what he had done. The vehicles pulled up outside Rosie's Diner, and Vincent could see through the windows that the crowd inside had grown, people pressing against the glass to watch what was happening. His people had already established a perimeter without being told, blocking the exits and making sure that no one left before Vincent had a chance to address the situation. He stepped out of the car and straightened his jacket, his face composed into an expression that revealed nothing of the storm raging inside him. The door to Rosie's Diner opened and Vincent Johnson walked inside, with the kind of presence that made everyone instinctively turn to look at him. He moved with the confidence of a man who had never doubted his right to occupy any space he entered, his eyes scanning the room and taking in every detail from the positions of the people to the exits to the man standing near the back booth who had to be Derek Hoffman. Vincent's security detail followed him inside and spread out with practiced efficiency, positioning themselves to cover every angle without being overtly threatening to the innocent customers. Vincent's focus narrowed immediately to the corner booth, where Lisa sat holding Marcus, and nothing else in the world mattered to him in that moment except getting to his family. He crossed the diner in long strides that ate up the distance, his expensive shoes making soft sounds on the checkered floor. People moved out of his way without being asked, pressing themselves against walls and booths to clear a path for the man whose reputation preceded him into every room he entered. He knelt beside the booth with a gentleness that seemed impossible for someone his size, his large hands reaching out to touch Marcus's face with the kind of tender care that only a father could show. The boy looked up at him with eyes that were still wet with tears but trying so hard to be brave, and Vincent felt his heart clench in his chest. He examined the split lip and the swelling bruise that was already darkening Marcus's cheek, his jaw tightening as he assessed the damage that had been done to his child. Marcus tried to smile through the pain because he always wanted to make his father proud, and Vincent brushed his thumb gently across his son's forehead in a gesture of comfort and reassurance. He asked the boy if he was okay, and Marcus nodded even though they both knew it was not entirely true. But the question and answer were more about connection than actual information. Vincent kissed his son's forehead and then stood up, his demeanor shifting as he turned, away from his family and toward the man who had caused the situation. The transformation was subtle but unmistakable as Vincent's expression changed from loving father to something far more dangerous. His eyes went cold and hard, his shoulders squared, and his entire body language communicated threat in a way that made several people in the diner take involuntary steps backward. He looked at Lisa and asked her a single-word question, and she pointed toward Derek Hoffman without hesitation or mercy. Derek had been standing near his booth trying to maintain his bravado in front of his friends, but the arrival of Vincent Johnson and his security team had planted the first seeds of doubt in his mind. He watched as the tall black man crossed the diner and knelt beside the boy he had struck, and something about the way everyone in the diner reacted to this man's presence made Derek realize that he might have made a serious mistake. His friends shuffled nervously beside him, their eyes darting between Derek and the newcomer as they tried to figure out what was happening. Vincent began walking toward Derek with measured steps that seemed to count down to something inevitable. Each footfall was deliberate and unhurried, the pace of someone who knew that their target had nowhere to run and all the time in the world to reach them. Derek felt his mouth go dry as this imposing figure approached him, and he tried to summon the anger that had driven him to strike the child in the first place but found it had evaporated in the face of real danger. The distance between them closed until Vincent stopped just a few feet away from Derek, close enough that the bigger man could see every detail of his face. Vincent's expression was completely neutral, neither angry nor threatening, which somehow made him more frightening than if he had been shouting or making overt displays of aggression. He looked at Derek with the kind of focused attention that made the other man feel like a bug under a microscope. Examined and found wanting, Derek tried to recover some of his earlier confidence and demanded to know if Vincent had a problem, his voice coming out louder than he intended as he attempted to sound tough. Vincent did not react to the bluster, instead simply stating the fact that Derek had struck his son. The words were calm and measured, delivered without heat or emotion, but they carried the weight of an accusation that could not be denied or defended against. Derek laughed, but it was a nervous sound that fooled no one, least of all himself. He tried to justify his actions by claiming that the boy had run into him and needed to learn manners, the words spilling out of his mouth as he attempted to make himself believe that he had been in the right. Vincent listened without interrupting, his face showing nothing as Derek dug his own grave deeper with every syllable. When Derek finished his pathetic explanation, Vincent asked him a simple question about whether hitting a 7-year-old child was his idea of teaching manners. The question hung in the air between them, unanswerable in any way that would not make Derek look like the bully and coward that he was. Derek opened his mouth to respond but found that he had no words that would justify what he had done, and his silence was more damning than any confession could have been. Vincent took a step closer and asked Derek if he knew who he was, and the way he phrased the question made it clear that this was not idle curiosity, but rather a test of some kind. Derek felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead as he realized that this might be more serious than he had thought, that perhaps this was not just an angry father, but something more dangerous. He tried to bluff and asked why he should know or care who Vincent was, but his voice cracked slightly. On the last word, Raymond Carter stepped forward with a datapad in his hands and began reading off information about Derek Hoffman in a flat, professional tone that made it sound like a legal proceeding. He listed Derek's employment history, his complaints and lawsuits, his various incidents of violence and discrimination across multiple colonies. Each fact was delivered with precision and backed up by documentation that appeared on the datapad's screen, a comprehensive dossier that showed how thoroughly Vincent's organization had researched Derek in the few minutes since Lisa's call. Derek's face went pale as he listened to his own history being recited in front of everyone in the diner, realizing that this man knew everything about him down to details that Derek himself had forgotten. He stammered and asked how they could possibly know all of that information. His earlier confidence completely shattered by the realization that he was dealing with someone who had resources and reach far beyond anything he had imagined. Vincent explained in that same calm voice that he knew everything that happened in his territory, and Derek felt his stomach drop as understanding finally dawned. This was Vincent Johnson, the crime boss who controlled the eastern sector, the man whose name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect across a dozen worlds. Derek had just assaulted the son of the most powerful criminal in this part of the galaxy, and he had done it in the man's own territory. One of Derek's friends tried to ease toward the door, moving slowly as if hoping no one would notice his departure. Two of Vincent's security people blocked his path without saying a word or making any threatening gestures, simply standing in the way with expressions that made it clear movement was not an option. The friend froze and then backed up to rejoin Derek, all thoughts of escape abandoned in the face of that silent wall. Vincent continued speaking, explaining that he had built his empire on 3 principles that he held sacred above all else: respect for those who earned it, loyalty to those who gave it, and protection for those who needed it. Derek had violated all 3 of these principles when he put his hands on Marcus, and Vincent wanted to make sure Derek understood the magnitude of his mistake. The words were not threats but rather statements of fact, delivered with the certainty of someone who had never failed to follow through on their intentions. Derek's survival instincts finally kicked in and overrode whatever pride or stupidity had been keeping him rooted in place, and he bolted for the door with the desperate energy of a man who suddenly understood how much danger he was in. He made it exactly 3 steps before Raymond Carter moved with the speed and precision of his military training, catching Derek's arm in a grip that looked casual but made the bigger man cry out in pain. Raymond held him effortlessly despite Derek's attempts to pull away, his expression never changing from that professional calm that was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. Vincent's security detail moved in to surround Derek and his friends, not rushing or making any aggressive moves but simply positioning themselves in a way that made it clear that no one was leaving, until Vincent decided they could. The other customers in the diner watched with a mixture of fear and fascination, some of them recording on their communicators while others simply sat frozen in their seats. Rosie stood behind the counter with both hands pressed against the surface as if she needed it to hold herself up, her elderly face showing the strain of witnessing something she had never expected to see in her establishment. Derek's bravado had completely evaporated and was replaced by pure terror as he realized that he was trapped with no way out and no one coming to save him. He began to beg, the words tumbling out of his mouth in a desperate stream as he pleaded for mercy and claimed that he had not known Marcus was Vincent's son. His voice went high and thin with panic, all traces of the tough guy who had struck a child completely gone in the face of real consequences for his actions. Vincent listened to the begging without any visible reaction, his face still maintaining that neutral expression that gave nothing away. When Derek finally ran out of words and stood there gasping for breath with tears starting to form in his eyes, Vincent spoke in a voice that was quiet, but carried clearly through the silent diner. He pointed out that the problem was not just that Derek had hit Vincent's son specifically, but that Derek had felt comfortable hitting any child at all. The distinction was important because it revealed the rot at Derek's core, the belief that violence against the weak was acceptable as long as you did not get caught. Vincent continued by saying that Derek needed to understand that actions had consequences, and since Derek apparently had gone through life without learning that lesson, Vincent would teach it to him now. The words were delivered without malice or satisfaction, simply a statement of intent from someone who had decided on a course of action and would see it through to completion. Derek whimpered and tried to pull away from Raymond's grip, but the former colonel held him as easily, as if he were restraining a child. Vincent pulled out his communicator and made a call while Derek watched in growing horror, and within minutes the sound of approaching vehicles could be heard outside the diner. News drones began arriving and hovering outside the windows, their cameras focusing on the scene inside and broadcasting it live to millions of people across the sector. Vincent had called them deliberately because he wanted this to be public, wanted everyone to see what happened when someone crossed the line he had drawn around innocent people in his territory. More of Vincent's people arrived and began setting up equipment outside, and soon the diner was surrounded by lights and cameras that turned it into an impromptu broadcast stage. Vincent positioned himself so that the cameras would have a clear view, and Derek realized with mounting dread that whatever was about to happen would be witnessed by countless people across multiple worlds. He tried to protest, but Raymond tightened his grip just enough to make it clear that silence would be the better option. Vincent addressed the cameras directly, his voice clear and authoritative as he identified Derek Hoffman by name and described what he had done. He laid out the facts without embellishment or emotion, simply stating that Derek had assaulted a 7-year-old child in broad daylight in front of witnesses. Vincent then added that Derek had done so because of prejudice and hatred, beliefs that humanity had supposedly left behind when they reached for the stars, but that still lingered in the hearts of small-minded men. The crowd outside the diner had grown as people realized something significant was happening, and the mix of humans and aliens pressed close to see what Vincent Johnson was doing. His organization was known throughout the sector not just for its criminal activities, but for its code of honor, and people were curious to see how that code would be applied in this situation. Vincent had built his reputation on being ruthless to his enemies, but protective of the communities under his control, and this incident seemed to sit at the intersection of those two aspects. Vincent turned his attention back to Derek and spoke directly to him in a voice that the cameras would pick up clearly. He told Derek that he could kill him right there and no one would stop him, that he had the power and the authority within his organization to end Derek's life with a word. Derek's legs nearly gave out beneath him, and only Raymond's grip kept him upright as the full weight of his situation crashed down on him. He had assaulted the child of a man who commanded an army and controlled territory spanning multiple planets, and that man was now deciding his fate in front of millions of witnesses. But Vincent was not finished talking, and he went on to say that despite what the authorities claimed about him, he was not a monster who killed without purpose. He was a father first and foremost, and as a father he wanted his son to see that justice did not always require blood to be satisfied. The statement confused Derek until Vincent gestured to Raymond, who produced a tablet and began pulling up holographic documents that appeared in the air between them where the cameras could capture every detail. Vincent explained that his people had done some research into Derek's mining company in the brief time since the incident, and what they had found was a pattern of exploitation and abuse that went far beyond Derek's personal failings. Workers across 3 different colonies had been subjected to unsafe conditions, withheld pay, and systematic discrimination that violated both human law and galactic treaties. Derek had been using his position to hurt people on a massive scale, and Vincent had decided that the appropriate punishment was not death, but rather complete destruction of everything Derek had built. The holographic documents showed financial records, communication logs, and witness statements that painted a damning picture of corruption and cruelty. Derek watched in horror as his entire operation was laid bare for the galaxy to see, every shady deal and every abused worker exposed to public scrutiny. Vincent announced that he was buying the mining company immediately, right then with the transaction being processed even as they spoke. His people had contacted the board of directors with an offer that was generous enough that they had accepted without hesitation, and the sale would be finalized within the hour. Derek tried to protest, saying that Vincent could not do that, but his voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Vincent smiled for the first time since entering the diner, but it was a cold expression that held no warmth or humor. He informed Derek that it was already done, that the board had been happy to take his money and cut Derek loose. Every worker who had been exploited would receive full compensation, including back pay, medical care for any injuries sustained on the job, and a bonus for their suffering. The mining operation would be reformed under new management that actually cared about safety and fairness. Vincent stepped closer to Derek until they were nearly face to face, and his voice dropped to a level that the cameras could not quite pick up. He told Derek that while the public punishment was losing his company and his reputation, there was a private understanding that needed to be reached. Derek had put his hands on Vincent's child, and that was a transgression that went beyond business or public justice. If Derek ever came near Vincent's family again, if he ever hurt another innocent person anywhere in the galaxy, there would be no mercy and no second chances. Vincent would hunt him down and end him in ways that would serve as a warning to anyone else who might consider crossing that line. Derek nodded frantically, tears streaming down his face as he understood that he was being allowed to live, but that his life as he knew it was over. Vincent straightened and returned his voice to a level the cameras would catch, announcing that Derek Hoffman was banned from the Eastern Sector, effective immediately and permanently. He would be escorted to a transport and placed on the next ship leaving the system, and if he ever returned, he would be arrested on sight. Vincent's people would make sure every authority in the sector had Derek's information, and there would be no place for him to hide if he violated the terms of his exile. Raymond and 2 other security personnel took hold of Derek and began escorting him toward the door, the broken man offering no resistance as he shuffled between them with his head hanging low. His friends were questioned briefly and then released with warnings that their association with Derek had been noted, and they fled the diner without looking back at the man they had stood beside just minutes before. The cameras followed Derek's exit, capturing every moment of his humiliation for the millions of viewers who were watching the live broadcast across the galactic network. Vincent stood in the center of the diner for a moment longer, his eyes scanning the crowd of customers who had witnessed everything. He thanked them for their patience and assured them that their meals would be covered by his organization as compensation for the disruption. Rosie tried to protest that it was not necessary, but Vincent insisted, and the elderly woman finally nodded her acceptance with tears in her eyes. She had known the Johnson family for years and had watched Marcus grow from a baby into the sweet boy he was, and seeing someone hurt him had broken her heart. The crime boss turned away from the cameras and the crowd, his public duties completed, and walked back to the corner booth where his family waited. The transformation that came over him was remarkable as he left behind the persona of the powerful criminal and became simply a father again. He slid into the booth beside Marcus and gathered the boy into his arms, holding him close in a way that spoke of fierce protection and unconditional love. Lisa leaned against her husband's shoulder, and the 3 of them sat together in silence for a moment, a small island of family in the chaos that surrounded them. Marcus looked up at his father with those wide, innocent eyes and asked in a small voice if he had done something wrong. The question hit Vincent harder than any punch ever could because it revealed that his son was blaming himself for the violence that had been inflicted upon him. Vincent took his son's face gently in his hands and looked directly into his eyes as he told him that he had done nothing wrong, that sometimes bad people did bad things, and it was never the fault of their victims. He wanted Marcus to understand that the responsibility for Derek's actions lay solely with Derek himself. Lisa placed her hand on Vincent's arm and told him that Marcus needed to know the truth about who his father was, that the boy was old enough to understand at least the basics of the situation. Vincent had been dreading this conversation for years, hoping to keep his son innocent of the realities of his business for as long as possible. But his wife was right, and the events of today had forced the issue in a way that could not be ignored or postponed. Marcus deserved to know why his father had the kind of power that could bring a man to tears and strip away his entire life with a few phone calls. Vincent took a deep breath and began to explain, in terms that a 7-year-old could grasp. He told Marcus that he ran an organization that did things the regular laws did not approve of, that people called him a crime boss and a criminal. He saw the confusion in his son's face and tried to clarify by explaining that he was a protector who made sure their neighborhood was safe, and that people who had nowhere else to turn had someone to help them. It was a simplified version of the truth, but it captured the essential elements of how Vincent saw himself and his role in the community. Marcus thought about this for a long moment, his young mind working through the complicated idea of someone who broke the laws but also protected people. Finally, he asked if that meant his father was like a superhero, and Vincent had to smile sadly at the innocent question. He explained that heroes did not break the law, that what he did was different and more complicated than the stories Marcus had heard. But he also emphasized that he tried to do what was right, even when it meant going against the official rules, and that sometimes the system failed people who needed protection. The boy seemed to accept this explanation with the flexible understanding that children possess, not fully grasping all the implications but trusting in his father's essential goodness. Vincent felt a weight settle on his heart as he realized that he had just destroyed a piece of his son's innocence, that Marcus would now carry the knowledge that his father was a criminal, no matter how justified Vincent believed his actions to be. But there was no taking it back now, and perhaps it was better that Marcus learned this lesson from his father rather than from strangers. or enemies who would use it to hurt him. The news drones outside began to disperse as the story moved from breaking news to analysis, and Vincent's security detail started the process of securing the area and making sure there would be no retaliation from Derek's associates. Raymond returned and reported that Derek had been placed on a transport ship that would take him to the outer colonies, far from the eastern sector and Vincent's reach. The man had been stripped of his identification credentials for the sector and flagged in every system as persona non grata, effectively making him an exile with no hope of return. Vincent nodded his approval and then asked Raymond to arrange for a medical team to check Marcus, even though the injuries appeared minor. He wanted to make absolutely certain that his son had not suffered any damage that was not immediately visible. Raymond made the call, and within minutes a doctor arrived with portable scanning equipment. A woman who had worked with Vincent's organization for years and knew to be discreet about what she saw and heard. The doctor examined Marcus with gentle efficiency, using her scanners to check for any internal injuries or complications. She cleaned and treated the split lip, applied a healing gel that would reduce the swelling and bruising, and gave him a clean bill of health aside from the superficial wounds. She told Marcus that he was very brave and gave him a lollipop from her medical bag, which made the boy smile for the first time since the incident. Vincent thanked her and arranged for payment to be transferred to her account, adding a significant bonus for her prompt response. As the doctor left, Vincent received a message on his communicator from one of his information specialists. The broadcast of the incident had already been viewed by over 50 million people across the sector and was spreading rapidly to other parts of human space and beyond. The public response was overwhelmingly supportive, with people praising Vincent for his measured response and his protection of a vulnerable child. There were some critics who argued that he had overstepped his bounds and acted as judge and jury without legal authority, but they were drowned out by the majority who felt that justice had been served. The Galactic Council's human representatives had issued a statement saying that, while they could not officially condone Vincent's actions, they understood the sentiment behind them and would not be pursuing any charges related to the incident. It was a carefully worded message that acknowledged the political reality that Vincent Johnson commanded too much popular support and too many resources to be easily challenged. The alien ambassadors from several species had also released statements supporting the protection of children and condemning prejudice, though they avoided mentioning Vincent by name. Vincent read through the reports with a critical eye, looking for any signs of trouble that might be brewing beneath the surface. His position was secure for now, but he knew that there would be people in positions of authority who resented his display of power and would look for ways to undermine him in the future. That was the nature of the game he played. An endless chess match where every move had to be calculated and every potential threat assessed. For now, though, he had sent a clear message that would make people think twice before targeting anyone under his protection. Lisa suggested they should go home, and Vincent agreed that it was time to leave the diner and let Rosie get back to her normal business. They stood as a family, and Marcus held both his parents' hands as they walked toward the door. The remaining customers applauded as they passed, a spontaneous show of support that surprised Vincent even after all his years of reading people and situations. He nodded his thanks but did not stop to acknowledge the applause, focused instead on getting his son home where he could feel safe and secure. The ride home was quiet as Marcus sat between his parents in the back seat of the armored vehicle, his small hand still holding his mother's while his head rested against his father's side. Vincent stared out the window at the city passing by, his mind already moving ahead to the various consequences and opportunities that would arise from today's events. He had made a public statement that would reverberate through the criminal underworld and legitimate society alike, and he needed to be prepared for whatever responses came his way. Raymond sat in the front passenger seat, coordinating with the other security vehicles that formed a protective convoy around the Johnson family. The route home varied from their usual path, a standard security precaution that Vincent insisted upon whenever there was even a remote possibility of retaliation. They wound through different neighborhoods and used back streets that would make it difficult for anyone to set up an ambush, though Vincent doubted that Derek had the connections or resources to organize anything so quickly after being exiled. Lisa broke the silence by asking Vincent what would happen next, and he understood that she was not asking about immediate logistics, but rather about the broader implications of his very public display of power. He told her quietly that there would be challenges from various quarters as people tested whether his response had been a one-time event or a new standard that he intended to enforce consistently. Some of his rivals might see it as weakness that he had not simply killed Derek, while others would recognize it as a more sophisticated form of punishment that served multiple purposes. The mining company that he had seized from Derek would need to be reformed and properly managed, which meant installing trustworthy people in key positions and conducting a thorough audit of all operations. Vincent had meant what he said about compensating the workers who had been exploited, and he would make sure that promise was kept, even if it cost him more than the company was worth. His reputation depended on people believing that his word was absolute, and he would not compromise that foundation for the sake of short-term profit. They arrived at the Johnson home, a sprawling estate on the outskirts of the city that was protected by state-of-the-art security systems and a permanent detail of guards. The property had been chosen as much for its defensible position as for its luxury, with clear sight lines in all directions and multiple escape routes built into the architecture. Vincent had learned long ago that a smart criminal never allowed himself to be trapped in a corner, and his home reflected that philosophy in every design choice. Marcus perked up as they pulled through the gates, recognizing the familiar surroundings and the safety they represented. The boy had friends in the neighborhood and a life that was as normal as Vincent could make it, given the circumstances of who his father was. Lisa had insisted that Marcus attend regular school, rather than being privately tutored, wanting him to have social connections and experiences beyond the insulated world of Vincent's organization. It had been a point of contention between them at first, but Vincent had eventually agreed that his son needed to understand how ordinary people lived if he was going to have any chance of choosing a different path. Inside the house, Lisa took Marcus upstairs to help him clean up and change out of his clothes, which still bore traces of blood from his split lip. Vincent went to his office and began making calls to his various lieutenants, getting updates on how the organization was responding to the day's events and issuing new orders where necessary. He spoke with his financial people about the mining company acquisition and authorized them to begin the process of restructuring it according to ethical guidelines that would have seemed laughable coming from a crime boss if his people had not known he was serious. Raymond joined him after ensuring the house security was fully active, and the two men reviewed the surveillance footage from the diner that Vincent's people had collected from multiple angles. The video would be useful if anyone challenged his version of events, providing clear evidence that Derek had struck Marcus without provocation and that Vincent's response had been proportional given the circumstances. Raymond suggested that they leak some of the footage showing Derek's mining operation abuses to news outlets, turning public opinion even further against the man and making it impossible for him to rebuild his reputation anywhere in human space. Vincent considered the suggestion and approved it, though he instructed Raymond to be subtle about the leak and make it seem like it came from whistleblowers within the mining company, rather than from his organization. The goal was to destroy Derek completely without making it look like Vincent was still actively pursuing a vendetta, which could be seen as petty or vindictive. Better to let Derek's own actions condemn him in the eyes of the public, with Vincent simply providing the platform for that information to become known. The evening news broadcasts led with the story of what had happened at Rosie's diner, showing footage of Vincent confronting Derek and announcing his punishment. The commentators were split in their analysis, with some praising Vincent's protection of a child and others condemning his extralegal actions. Several prominent politicians weighed in with carefully neutral statements that acknowledged the injustice done to Marcus, while also noting that vigilante justice was not acceptable in a civilized society. Vincent watched the coverage with detached interest, noting which public figures supported him and which ones would need to be managed more carefully in the future. Lisa came down to the office after putting Marcus to bed and sat beside her husband on the leather couch that faced the wall of monitors. She asked him if he thought they had done the right thing by exposing Marcus to this reality at such a young age, and Vincent admitted that he did not know. He had always known this day would come eventually, but he had hoped to have more time before his son had to understand the true nature of his father's work. The incident had forced his hand, and now Marcus would grow up knowing that his father was someone whom people feared, and Vincent was not sure how that knowledge would shape the boy's development. Lisa reminded him that Marcus was smart and resilient, qualities he had inherited from both his parents, and that they would help him navigate this complicated reality. She had grown up in the organization herself, daughter of one of Vincent's earliest associates, and she understood better than most what it meant to be part of this world. Her love for Vincent had never wavered, despite knowing exactly what he was capable of, and she had faith that Marcus would find his own way to reconcile the loving father he knew with the powerful criminal that the rest of the world saw. Vincent pulled his wife close and allowed himself a moment of vulnerability that few people ever witnessed. He told her that sometimes he wondered if he had made the right choices in life, whether he should have found a different path that would have allowed him to give his family a normal existence. Lisa laughed softly and pointed out that normal was overrated, and that she had never wanted an ordinary life anyway. She had chosen to marry him with full knowledge of who he was and what he did, and she would choose him again if given the chance to go back and reconsider. They sat together in comfortable silence as the news continued to play on the screens, watching the story of their day unfold from multiple perspectives and interpretations. Vincent's communicator buzzed periodically with messages from associates and allies across the sector, some offering support and others seeking to curry favor in the wake of his demonstration of power. He ignored most of them, focusing instead on the warmth of his wife beside him and the knowledge that his son was safe upstairs. Raymond appeared in the doorway to report that Derek Hoffman's transport had left the sector and was on course for the frontier colonies, where law enforcement was minimal and opportunities for a disgraced mining boss were even less so. The man's accounts had been frozen and his assets seized as part of the company acquisition, leaving him with barely enough credits to survive for a few months if he was careful. It was a complete and total destruction of everything Derek had built, accomplished in less than 6 hours from the moment he had struck Marcus. The following days brought a cascade of consequences and reactions that rippled through every level of society in the eastern sector and beyond. Vincent's organization fielded hundreds of inquiries from people who had been victims of similar injustices and were hoping that the powerful crime boss might intervene on their behalf, as he had for his own son. Raymond and the other lieutenants had to develop a system for triaging these requests, separating genuine cases of abuse from opportunists trying to exploit Vincent's demonstrated willingness to act against bullies and predators. Vincent made it clear that while he could not personally address every injustice in the galaxy, his organization would prioritize cases involving children and those who had no other recourse to justice. He authorized the creation of a new division within his network, specifically dedicated to investigating reports of abuse and exploitation, staffing it with former law enforcement officers and social workers who had become disillusioned with the official system. It was a risky expansion of his operations into territory that blurred the lines between criminal enterprise and vigilante justice, but Vincent calculated that the public support would outweigh any potential backlash. The workers from Derek's mining operations began coming forward with their stories, emboldened by the knowledge that the man who had terrorized them was now powerless and exiled. The tales of abuse were worse than Vincent's initial investigation had revealed, with some workers having suffered permanent injuries from unsafe conditions, while others had been denied medical care for treatable illnesses. Vincent's financial team worked around the clock to process compensation claims and arrange for proper medical treatment, spending far more than the mining company was worth, but establishing a reputation for following through on promises that money could not buy. News outlets across human space picked up the story and ran with it from every possible angle, some framing Vincent as a folk hero standing up for the vulnerable, while others portrayed him as a dangerous criminal whose power threatened the rule of law. The debate played out in editorial pages and broadcast panels, with legal scholars arguing about the implications of allowing private citizens to mete out justice outside the court system. Vincent watched this discourse with interest but did not engage directly, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves rather than getting drawn into philosophical debates he had no interest in winning. The Galactic Council convened an emergency session to discuss the incident, with representatives from 24 species debating whether to issue formal sanctions against Vincent or the Earth government for failing to control him. The human ambassador found herself in the difficult position of having to defend actions she personally found troubling while also acknowledging that Vincent Johnson commanded too much popular support to be easily opposed. Several alien species expressed admiration for the swift justice, noting that their own cultures valued the protection of young ones above almost all other concerns, and saw Vincent's response as entirely appropriate. In the end, the council issued a carefully worded statement, condemning violence against children and calling for proper legal channels to address such incidents, while conspicuously avoiding any mention of Vincent Johnson by name or any specific sanctions against him. It was a political compromise that satisfied no one, but allowed everyone to claim a partial victory. Vincent received a private communication from the human ambassador, warning him that his next transgression would not be handled so leniently, to which he replied with assurances that he had no intention of making extra-legal punishment a regular occurrence unless absolutely necessary. Marcus returned to school after taking a few days off to let his visible injuries heal, and Vincent had extensive discussions with the principal and teachers about security measures. He wanted his son to have as normal an experience as possible, while also ensuring that no one would dare harm the boy again. The school administrators walked a delicate line between accommodating the requests of a powerful parent and maintaining the fiction that Marcus was just another student. His classmates treated him with a mixture of awe and uncertainty, having seen the news coverage of his father confronting Derek and understanding for the first time that Marcus was different from them in significant ways. Vincent watched his son carefully for signs of trauma or behavioral changes, consulting with child psychologists who specialized in helping young people process violence and fear. Marcus seemed remarkably resilient, bouncing back with the adaptability of childhood, though he did have nightmares for several weeks that required his parents' comfort and reassurance. The therapists assured Vincent that this was normal, and that with proper support Marcus would likely emerge from the experience without lasting psychological damage, though they cautioned that his understanding of his father's true nature might create complications as he grew older and developed more sophisticated moral reasoning. The incident had the immediate effect of dramatically reducing hate crimes and violence against vulnerable populations throughout Vincent's territory. People who might have considered acting on their prejudices or bullying those weaker than themselves suddenly had to contend with the very real possibility that Vincent Johnson would take a personal interest in their actions. The crime boss had inadvertently created a deterrent more effective than any law enforcement campaign, using his reputation for swift and comprehensive punishment to make potential abusers think twice before acting. Vincent's rivals in the criminal underworld had mixed reactions to his handling of the situation. Some saw it as weakness that he had not simply killed Derek and sent a more traditional message about the consequences of crossing him. Others recognized it as a sophisticated demonstration of power that expanded his influence into new areas and generated positive publicity that would make it harder for authorities to move against him. A few attempted to test whether Vincent's protective instincts extended beyond his own family by deliberately targeting children in areas near his territory, gambling that he would not intervene in matters that did not directly affect him. Those gamblers lost their bets as Vincent made good on his implied promise to protect all children in his sector, sending his people to deal with several high-profile cases of abuse and exploitation in the weeks following the diner incident. Each intervention was handled with the same combination of public exposure and private consequences that he had used with Derek, building a pattern that made it clear this was not a one-time reaction, but rather a new operational priority for his organization. The message spread quickly, through both legitimate and criminal channels, that hurting kids in Vincent Johnson's territory was now the fastest way to destroy your life. Raymond expressed concerns about the expansion of their activities into what amounted to a private child protection service, noting that it stretched their resources and drew attention from law enforcement agencies that had previously tolerated Vincent's more traditional criminal enterprises. Vincent acknowledged the risks but insisted that the benefits outweighed them, both in terms of public support and in alignment with his personal code of ethics. He had built his empire on the principle that power should be used to protect those who could not protect themselves, and extending that protection more broadly was simply living up to the values he claimed to hold. The financial costs of the new initiative were substantial as Vincent's organization funded investigations, provided compensation to victims, and in some cases completely restructured businesses or institutions that had been covering up abuse. His accountants warned that if he continued at this pace, he would deplete his reserves within a year. But Vincent authorized them to shift resources from less profitable ventures to support the protective operations. He had more money than he could spend in several lifetimes, and using it to create real change seemed more worthwhile than hoarding it for no purpose beyond accumulation. 3 months after the incident at Rosie's Diner, Vincent stood in his office overlooking New Seattle as the sun set behind the distant mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the earth he had left behind decades ago. Marcus was downstairs doing homework under his mother's supervision, the boy's injuries long since healed, though the memory of that day remained fresh in Vincent's mind. The crime boss had spent the intervening weeks consolidating the changes he had set in motion, transforming a moment of personal vengeance into something larger and more meaningful. The mining company that had belonged to Derek Hoffman was now one of the most ethically run operations in the sector, with worker safety standards that exceeded legal requirements and compensation packages that made it difficult for competitors to retain their own employees. Vincent had installed a former union organizer as CEO and given her complete authority to run the company according to principles of fairness and dignity, checking in only occasionally to ensure that his investment was being managed properly. The workers had responded with loyalty and productivity that made the company more profitable than it had been under Derek's mismanagement, proving that treating people decently was not just morally correct but also good business. The Child Protection Initiative that Vincent had established was now handling over 100 cases per month, with a staff of investigators and social workers who operated across multiple planets in the eastern sector. They worked in cooperation with local authorities when possible, and independently when necessary, filling gaps in the official system that allowed vulnerable children to fall through cracks. Vincent had been surprised by how many law enforcement officers and government officials quietly supported the effort, providing tips and information that helped his people identify situations that needed intervention. Raymond entered the office with his daily briefing, a routine they had maintained for years that covered everything from financial reports to security threats. He informed Vincent that Derek Hoffman had been located working in a mining camp on the frontier, doing manual labor for subsistence wages and living in conditions far worse than those he had imposed on his own workers. The former boss had tried to rebuild his reputation, but found that Vincent's thorough destruction of his name had followed him across the galaxy, with no one willing to hire or do business with someone who had been so publicly humiliated. Vincent felt no satisfaction at this news, only a sense of completion that justice had been fully served. He asked Raymond to ensure that Derek remained on the watch list in case the man tried to return to the sector or harm anyone else, but otherwise they would leave him to his self-imposed exile. The goal had never been revenge, but rather protection and deterrence, and both had been accomplished without requiring Derek's death. Vincent had proven that power could be exercised with precision rather than brutality, and that lesson had not been lost on those who watched his operations. Marcus had asked his father several times about what happened to the man who hit him, displaying a child's natural curiosity about consequences and justice. Vincent had explained in age-appropriate terms that the man had lost everything he valued because he had hurt someone weaker than himself, and that this was the price people paid for cruelty. The boy seemed satisfied with this explanation, though he also asked his father to promise that he would never hurt anyone who did not deserve it. Vincent had made that promise, knowing it was more complicated than his son, understood but hoping that Marcus would hold him to it as he grew older and developed his own moral framework. Lisa joined Vincent at the window, slipping her hand into his as they watched the city lights begin to sparkle in the gathering darkness. She told him that she was proud of what he had accomplished in the aftermath of the incident, turning a moment of violence against their son into a force for positive change across the sector. Vincent admitted that he had not planned any of it, that his initial reaction had been pure fury that he had channeled into Derek's destruction, but that the subsequent developments had shown him new possibilities for using his power in ways that aligned with his values. They discussed Marcus's future and the choices he would face as he grew up, understanding that his father was both a criminal and a protector, someone who operated outside the law but according to a strict personal code. Lisa believed that their son would find his own path, that synthesized the best parts of what Vincent had taught him, with a stronger moral foundation that would allow him to work within legitimate systems. Vincent hoped she was right, but also recognized that children did not always turn out the way their parents hoped, and that Marcus might reject everything Vincent stood for or embrace it too completely. The communicator on Vincent's desk chimed with an incoming message from one of the Galactic Council ambassadors, a Vaxian who had been present during the interrupted meeting on the day of the incident. The message was brief and formal, requesting a meeting to discuss potential cooperation on anti-trafficking initiatives that aligned with Vincent's demonstrated interest in protecting vulnerable populations. Vincent showed the message to Lisa, who raised her eyebrows at the implication that his criminal organization was being courted by official galactic authorities for legitimate work. Raymond pointed out that accepting such cooperation would give Vincent's organization a degree of legitimacy that could protect them from prosecution while also constraining their freedom of action in other areas. It was a classic dilemma of whether to move toward respectability at the cost of effectiveness, and Vincent would need to consider carefully whether the trade-off was worth making. He told Raymond to set up the meeting but make no commitments, wanting to hear what the Vaxians had to offer before deciding whether their goals aligned sufficiently with his own. The news coverage of Vincent's organization had shifted noticeably in the months since the diner incident, with more outlets treating him as a complex figure rather than simply a criminal to be condemned. Several prominent journalists had requested interviews to explore the apparent contradiction of a crime boss who protected children and reformed exploitative businesses while also running illegal gambling operations and smuggling networks. Vincent had declined all such requests, preferring to maintain the mystique that came with silence rather than trying to explain himself in terms that civilians would understand. Marcus appeared in the doorway of the office, already in his pajamas and carrying the book he had been reading before bed. He asked his father if he would come read with him, a nightly ritual that Vincent rarely missed no matter how busy his day had been. Vincent excused himself from his wife and his second-in-command, following his son upstairs to the bedroom that was decorated with posters of spaceships and alien worlds that Marcus dreamed of visiting someday. They settled into the comfortable chair beside Marcus's bed and read together about adventures in distant galaxies, the boy's head resting against his father's chest as Vincent's deep voice brought the words to life. In these moments, Vincent forgot about criminal enterprises and galactic politics and the complicated legacy he was building, focusing only on being present for his son in the simple way that all fathers should be. Marcus asked questions about the story and made observations that showed his developing intelligence, and Vincent answered with the patience that he reserved exclusively for his family. When the chapter was finished and Marcus was drowsy with approaching sleep, the boy asked his father one more question that cut straight to the heart of everything Vincent had been wrestling with. Marcus wanted to know if being powerful meant you had to help people who could not help themselves, and Vincent paused to consider his answer carefully. He told his son that power created responsibility, whether you wanted it or not, and that choosing not to use your power to help others was the same as choosing to hurt them through inaction. Marcus thought about this and then said that when he grew up he wanted to have power so he could help people like his father did, but he wanted to do it in a way that everyone agreed was right instead of having to break laws. Vincent felt his heart swell with pride and pain in equal measure, recognizing that his son had already surpassed him in moral clarity, despite being only 7 years old. He told Marcus that this was a worthy goal and that he would support him in finding a better path than the one Vincent had walked. He kissed his son goodnight and watched as the boy's eyes drifted closed, his breathing evening out into the peaceful rhythm of sleep. Vincent stood in the doorway for a long moment, looking at the child he had brought into this complicated world, and hoping that he had given Marcus enough love and guidance to navigate it successfully. The incident at the diner had changed things in ways both large and small, forcing Vincent to confront questions about his legacy and the kind of world he wanted his son to inherit. Returning downstairs, Vincent found Lisa waiting for him with 2 glasses of wine and a knowing smile. She had seen this transformation happening in her husband over the past months, watching as he grappled with being both the feared crime boss and the gentle father who read bedtime stories. They sat together in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts about the future and the choices they would face.